I wonder. Do you guys ever wonder what would have happened in the gaming world if certain events occurred a different way? Do you always believe people when they say Nintendo saved gaming? We've all been told that for years. But how many of you believe Nintendo truly took US out of the gaming crash they were going through? How many of you think while Nintendo may have saved gaming in the US, if they didn't, another company would have easily done it? Then again, how many of you think Nintendo never saved anything and the US was fine where it was? Do you guys think it's possible that Nintendo gets way more credit in the saving of the US gaming crash than they deserve? Most of us already know the story of how Nintendo saved gaming, but I have a question for you. If Nintendo didn't do it, who do you think would have? What would gaming be like now without Nintendo? Is it possible that certain companies would have been more successful without Nintendo in their way? Or do you think all companies would have ended up the same way regardless if Nintendo was here or not? There's so many different questions and so many different outcomes. Sadly, there's no way we'd ever really know, but that doesn't mean we can't have a little fun with it. To do this, we need to go back to where the problem started, a time when gaming took a turn for the worst, a time where the saturation of games with a low quality took over, which in turn made a lot of people lose their interest, a time where home computers became a threat to consoles due to better graphics and sound capabilities, a time when hardware manufacturers lost their capability of making sure stores didn't become overburdened with merchandise. We need to revisit 1983. Here we are, at the end of the second console gaming generation. A pretty bad time to be a console gamer, especially here in the US. Game developers seem to have absolutely no idea what it is we, the gamers, want. Yeah, today developers know that shooters are the genre to go to, but at this point, there was no popular genre. So anything and everything was being made. Everyone's now trying to make a profit off of video games, and yet most of the people developing these games really have no idea what the hell they're doing. And because of that, developers are starting to come up with the worst assumption ever. If video games are popular, then we can make anything we want, and as long as it's a video game, it'll sell. So now here we are flooded with too many consoles we don't want and games we could care less about. Now people are also getting another genius idea. Take popular arcade games and port them to the console. And while the idea of taking the games we played at the arcades and putting them on the consoles may seem like a good idea, once we saw it, it didn't quite turn out the way we expected it to, especially with the developers being rushed to finish these games. At this point, there's also another threat to consider, which, strangely enough, is something that's not as big of a threat to consoles today, yet was big enough of a threat during this time to play a big enough part in the gaming crash. That threat was the PC. PCs during this time was becoming a much bigger investment, having more memory, better graphics, and being able to do other things consoles just simply couldn't do. So here we are, guys, in a situation of being saturated with consoles and games, being ran by an industry that had no idea what the hell they were doing, making mistake after mistake yet never learning from it, not giving developers enough time to create games that were expected to sell well, and noticing that the PCs were becoming a much better investment. Our scenario is now set up. We've entered the gaming crash of 1983, and now we're ready for what everyone else isn't: the introduction of a new console. All we need to do now is simply skip ahead a few years. Now let's jump ahead to October 18th, 1985. A new company by the name of Nintendo has brought something over to the US, something that a lot of people see and think, oh great, yet another console we don't want and more video games we could care less about. This new company had to have known what was happening with consoles in the US. How exactly did they sell something that already had a bad reputation before people even really knew what the hell it was? Stop. Let's freeze here. At this point, while the people of the 80s have no idea what Nintendo's little scheme is, we do. I'm sure we've all heard the story of how Nintendo saved the day. We know of Nintendo's clever marketing gimmick with their peripheral and how they used it to differentiate their console from the many different failures that tried to cash in on the once popular gaming industry. However, that's not why we're here. What if we were to play around with history a little bit? What if we alter a few of these things just to see how things could play out? Let's take the events with Nintendo's company, their consoles, and their peripherals, and flip everything in the opposite direction. Let's start this event over. October 18th, 1985. The gaming industry and gamers are still suffering from the crash, but a new company shows up by the name of Nintendo. However, with history change, the events leading up to the US getting a Nintendo console are now different. On July 15, 1983, Nintendo released a cartridge-based console called the Famicom. However, the arcade ports made for it didn't give people a good enough reason to buy the console. They felt that buying something that offers what they already played wasn't a good investment. In the end, it ended up being a failure in Japan. Because of this, Nintendo figured they'd have a better chance of selling it in other countries, especially the US. To prevent people from realizing that they were just getting yet another failed console, they decided to do two things. 1. Change the name from Famicom to the Nintendo Entertainment System, while also changing the appearance of the console. And 2. Selling the console with a peripheral to trick people into thinking the console was something completely different than what people were used to seeing. However, sadly, no peripheral, be it the Rob or the NES Zapper, was enough of a difference to get people to buy the console. As far as they were concerned, it was no different than the Atari, ColecoVision, or Intellivision. It was simply another console with low quality games that no one wanted. The NES was a failure. Nintendo at this point declares bankruptcy. And now, the fun begins. Now with the main event changed, everything after it can change as well. Two questions now come up. Question 1. What company can now take over as the company with the best console? Question 2. Where do all of the companies that helped Nintendo get where they would have been go now? One thing we have to remember about Nintendo is that while their main titles did play a big role in their first console's success, it was their third-party developers that also played almost just as big of a role. Yes, games like Mario and Zelda did play a big role, but so did games like Mega Man, Castlevania, and Final Fantasy. So who can these titles go to? To figure this out, we simply have to first find out who Nintendo's main competitors were. Due to their big success, it may have seemed like they didn't have any competition at all, but they did. Two, in fact. One was Atari with their 7800, and the other was Sega with the Master System. Between these two companies, who do you guys think would have been more successful? To figure something like this out, we need to know our history on both of these companies, especially Atari. A lot of programmers that worked for Atari didn't like the fact that Atari refused to credit them for any of their work. None of the developers got recognized for anything they made. So around this time, Atari already had a pretty bad reputation with game developers. Meanwhile, leaving our scenario for a second, one of Sega's biggest problems with the Master System before wasn't because of anything that they themselves did wrong, but what Nintendo prevented them from being able to do right. You see, Nintendo controlled over 80% of the market share in North America, and they did it by making it so that third-party developers weren't allowed to release anything on competing consoles. Now, that makes sense for first-party developers, but third-party? So Sega wasn't able to get a lot of the third-party support that actually helped Nintendo get where they were. The lack of third-party support made it impossible for Sega to get most of the popular titles. It doesn't look so much like it was innovation that made Nintendo successful, especially when you consider the fact that the Sega Master System was actually a more powerful console. The true innovation was in the hands of Sega, but Nintendo prevented them from being able to truly use it. Although this may not have been intentional, but instead Nintendo's way of trying to prevent the past from repeating itself. It's still rather interesting. However, in our new scenario, that's not the problem anymore. And since it's not a problem, it should be rather easy now to answer who would take over as the top dog. The smarter move for the developers would be to go to the side of Sega. Now with Sega as the top dog, how exactly will the rest of the scenario play itself out? With Nintendo no longer in anyone's way, who else could work their way to the top? Who had a problem with being successful before but now has a better chance? Who's going to be Sega's mascot? Do they even need one? Come back next time as we completely redo history and create a whole new console war.